Hello, dear friends. I would like to say something about parshat toldot. And parshat toldot is really the parsha about Isaac. You might say Chayei Sarah and toldot to a certain extent. Toldot specifically. Now, so I would like to first say some things about Yitzhak. It's very hard being the son of Abraham. Abraham is, the first monotheist after generations. Of course, Adam and Noah are monotheists, but I mean after generations of idolatry. A man who set the tone, the first Hebrew. He was, of course, descended from Aver, but called Hebrew in the sense that he is looking for the one God and for a relationship with the one God. And Avram is very successful, and people follow him. As Ephron says to him, "Nesi Elohim ata b'tochenu." You are like a prince, a godly prince among us. And Abraham is rich and he's successful. When he goes out to battle, he wins. And along comes Isaac, and Isaac is the continuation. But it's not easy to live in the shadow of a famous father. We've seen that many times in history. The Vilna Gaon's son was a great scholar, but he lived, in a sense, in the shadow of his father because everybody knew his father better. So that can happen. But Isaac, there was something special about him. The first thing Isaac did then was to show that he's going in the path of his father. So he did many things that his father did. Especially we can see this in parshat toldot. Even though I have a different take on it, but not now, I'll just explain it the way I used to explain it. So as I said, he does many things that his father did. When he goes to Avimelech, the king of Gerar, he says that Rivka is his sister, not his wife. That has to be explained. And he digs wells in the land of the Philistines that Abraham had dug, and he just redigs them. So there are things that he does, and these things seem to be playing out things that Abraham did originally. And of course, he has two sons like Abraham. And Abraham says to God, Lu Yishmael Yichya lefanecha, let Ishmael go before you. Why do I need another son? And God said, no, because through Isaac shall be your seed. And Isaac has two children too. Now, at the Akedah, Isaac went along with his father in chapter 22. And Avram says to him, God told me I have to bring an offering on Mount Moriah, on one of the hills, and eventually that becomes Mount Moriah. And Isaac says, where is the lamb, Father? I see you have the knife, you have the wood, but where's the lamb? Abraham says, God will show us the lamb, my son. And again, it says they walk together. And obviously Isaac knows what's going on because Akedah means the binding of Isaac. Avram was over 100 years of age. Isaac had to help him bind his hands and his legs and mount him on the altar in preparation. So Isaac 100% knew exactly what was going on and agreed. If that's father's prophecy, then that's what I shall do. But after the Akedah, when Isaac thought that that would be the end, and then he opens his eyes because he does not hear the prophecy that Abraham hears from the angel who tells him not to touch the boy. And he opens up his eyes and he sees the ram. He starts wondering what just happened. And then Abraham returns. It says, Vayashav Avraham el Na'arav. Abraham returned to his lads, the two lads that came with him with the donkey. But it does not say that Isaac came back, even though at the beginning, Abraham says to the lads, we will go up and we will bow down and we will come back. We shall bow down and we shall come back. But at the end, Isaac does not come back. It says Abraham went back to the lads and they went to Beersheba, where they came from. Where did Isaac go? Well, we find him the next parsha, which is last week's parsha, Chayei Sarah. When Abraham's servant goes to look for a wife for Isaac, so he brings her to Isaac. And where is Isaac? Isaac is in Be'er Lachai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. And this name was given to that well by Ishmael and Hagar. God listened when Abraham sent Ishmael and Hagar into the desert. And she didn't want to see the boy die because they ran out of water. But the boy prayed, and God heard his voice. And then a wellspring came out of the ground. And that was called Be'er Lachai Roi, and that's where Ishmael lived. So when Isaac leaves Mount Moriah, he decides to go to the only other person in the world who knows what it means to be a son of Abraham. And his name is Ishmael. And Ishmael went through almost a similar experience to Isaac. Remember, he's sent out by Abraham. Abraham doesn't want to do it, but Sarah intervenes and says, no, you have to expel the lad and his mother. And God says, listen, whatever Sarah tells you, do. So Abraham reluctantly does it. And Ishmael almost dies until that wellspring comes out. So in a sense, Isaac went through the same thing. He thought he was on death row, and all of a sudden he didn't have to be that offering. So he has something in common now with Ishmael. But there's another side to this. Because God said through Sarah, if you want to say, because it's like divine inspiration, that you have to get rid of the maiden and the lad, which Abraham does. But Isaac, in this sense, he follows his father, but he has his own route in life as well. Isaac comes to the understanding that, no, I have to speak to Ishmael. I have to mend things. If I went through a similar experience, if one thing it now taught me, I have to spend time and bring him back home. Because maybe when we were young, my mother was afraid he would be a bad influence. But now we're older. We've seen life already. We can talk. And he is my father's son. So Isaac stays there and he lives in Be'er Lachai Roi, a neighbor of Ishmael. And he marries Rivka and he stays in Be'er Lachai Roi. And at the end of this week's parsha of Toldot, when Abraham dies, actually it's not this week's parsha, I think it's last week's parsha. When Abraham dies, it says, and Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him. And the Midrash, and Rashi brings us, says, why does it say Isaac, who was the younger before Ishmael? Because Ishmael decided to do tshuva. He came back to the fold, and he decided he is a legitimate son of Abraham. And he told Isaac, I know that God told you that you are the continuation. I accept it if that's what God told you. You put your name first. So Isaac was able to influence Ishmael and bring him back to the fold of the house of Abraham, despite everything Isaac went through and despite everything that Ishmael went through. Isaac is the big believer of the Hebrew spark in that person, of the godly spark in every person. That is Isaac. Therefore, it is not surprising that there is a very interesting Agadah in the Talmud, a story in the Talmud, on the verse in Isaiah 63:16. It says, Ki ata avinu, you are our father, O Lord. Ki Avraham lo yada'anu, Abraham would not know us. Yisrael lo yikrenu, and Israel would not even recognize us. You are our father, you are our redeemer. Me'olam shmecha, your name is forever. So the Talmud finds this passage very interesting because it mentions only Avraham and Yisrael, who's Yaakov. What happened to Isaac? So the Talmud says when it says Ki ata avinu, it's not referring to God, but to Isaac. And the Talmud tells a little story. And it says that God says to Abraham, your children have sinned, meaning later on in later generations. And Abraham says, Ha'avirem al kedushat shmecha. You can wipe them out on the sanctity of your name. And then God turns to Jacob and he says, your children have sinned. And he gets a similar answer. And then God turns to Isaac, says, your children have sinned. And Isaac says, my children, not your children? Didn't you say, B'ni B'chori Yisrael? Israel is my firstborn. And he says, let's figure it out. You say they've sinned. Now, how long does an average person live? 70 years, let's say, as King David says, three score and 10. Now, out of 70 years, into the first 20 years is not punishable, according to Torah law. Okay, that leaves 50. Now, out of those 50 years, a person eats and a person sleeps and they go to the bathroom and they certain things. Half the day is already gone. That leaves 25 years. So there's 25 years. So he says, God, you know what? You take half. I'll take half the 25, 12 and a half each. And let's just call it a day. I mean, you can't forgive that. And when the Jews heard that, they said, Isaac, you're our father. That's what the Talmud says. Meaning Isaac is able to look into somebody and find that hope, that spark of good in them. He can find it in Ishmael, and he can display it to Ishmael. Not only does he know Ishmael has a good spark, he can show it right to Ishmael until Ishmael realizes he has that spark, and he starts getting attracted to it. That is the power of Isaac. Isaac is a very introspective and insular type of person, but he's able to draw out of people things that we didn't even know we had within us. That explains why in parshat toldot, it says that Isaac loves Esau and Rivka loved Jacob. Isaac didn't know who Esau was. Of course he knew what Esau was. But he figured I was successful with Ishmael. Ishmael was from a different wife. Esau is from the same father and mother. Definitely he's got to have a spark. There's got to be a way to work with him. And Isaac decided to do things differently than his father. Because his father expelled Ishmael. Isaac said, I know what that's like. I don't want that to happen. I want Esau to remain within the fold. Even if Esau is not the one who's going to get the blessing of Abraham, because even after Isaac gives a blessing to Esau, gives the blessing of Esau to Jacob, he still gives another blessing to Jacob and gives him the blessing of Abraham at the end of the parsha. Despite telling Esau there's no other blessing, meaning there's no other blessing for you. So what's going on? Rivka was worried. She thought that Isaac made a mistake and didn't know who Esau was. Isaac knew who Esau was. He made no mistakes. When Esau takes two Hittite wives, it says that they were morat ruach. It was a very bitter spirit for both Isaac and Rivka that he had taken such pagan wives. He knows exactly who Esav is, but he believes that Esav has a grain of goodness and he wants to bring it out. That's what he means he loves Esau. Love meaning he gives to Esau. You always spend time with a weaker child, and that's what he was doing. Spending time with a weaker child to make sure that he could save him and bring him back to the fold. He's a hunter, great. Hunt. Use the food for good deeds. Give it to charity. Help people. Lots of things you can do as a hunter to help people. Go with somebody. Chanoch lanar pi darko, as it says in Proverbs. Educate the lad according to his way. Get into his mindset. That's what he was trying to do with Esau. And look at the blessing that he gave to Jacob, but was actually supposed to be the blessing to Esau. It was a totally physical blessing. May God give you from the dews of the heavens and from the plenty of the land. Dagan v'tirosh, and grain and grapes, and may your enemies, Yavducha Amim, may the peoples be subservient to you. And various nations, you shall be in charge of them. Those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. It's basically a very physical, political, national, physical type of blessing. It's not about spirituality. As the Sfat Emet, the Rebbe of Gur says, he knew who the two sons were, so he figured Esau will be the son who will be the political leader and the man of action, and Jacob will be the ideological, spiritual leader who will teach the spirit, and they'll work together. What's the problem? That's why when Jacob comes and takes the blessing of Esau, Yitzchak is very confused. Because why? You showed up so quickly? Said the hands are the hands of Esau, and the voice is the voice of Jacob, which could also be understood to mean, I thought the hands were supposed to be for Esau and only the voice for Jacob. I didn't know that Jacob also wanted the hands, meaning the practical world. But the decision that Isaac had made probably years before was, I'm not going to separate my sons. They're each going to get a blessing, but according to who they are. I know exactly who they are and the difference between them. But first, the older one will get the son, will get the blessing appropriate for him, and then I'll give Jacob the Abrahamic blessing. Why can't I do that? Now, Rivka did receive prophecy when the two boys were in her womb. It said, Shnei Leumim, you have two nations in your womb, and they're going to struggle, and the older one will be subservient to the younger one. Which means it's not just that Jacob will be the spiritual leader, he eventually will have to subdue Esav in order to bring him back to the fold. It's going to happen differently than Ishmael. Ishmael is able to work with Jacob. Esav is going to have a harder time working with Jacob. He will need to be controlled before he can work with Jacob. And so, just as Sarah interfered with Abraham's plan, Rivka interferes with Isaac's plan. And she switches the sons and makes sure, thinking that her husband doesn't know that Esav is not the saint, but he knows. But what she does is also from heaven, because she switches the sons, and this was the divine plan, because maybe not known to Isaac, Esav could not be in this relationship at this point in time as the way he envisioned it. And Jacob would have to do both in the meantime. Ad ki yavo Adoni Seira, until the time when we come to Seir in futuristic times, and Jacob and Esav again will be able to work together, just like Isaac and Ishmael did. But the time is not right. So sometimes a person has a plan, and they're going to do something. They're following on the one hand of their father's path, but they have their own path, what they're going to do. And then they're about to do it, and some event changes it, because it wasn't exactly the divine path. Because in the end, the divine path has to happen. Now, there's really more to say about Isaac, but maybe I'll leave this for another video. There are other things, too, in which Isaac had a plan. Because Isaac is passive. That's why he's called Midat Adin. The idea of his judgment or fear. And fear is something which is passive, makes you passive. That's why he doesn't leave the land of Israel. That's why he's the only one who marries only one wife, meaning without somebody else giving him another one, whether it's Laban or whether it's Sarah giving another one to Abraham. And but Isaac has his own way of being active through a passive form. So the first one was this: I'm going to give the blessings to both sons, but somehow God intervenes and makes Rivka do the trick. And this was actually what was supposed to happen. But first of all, what can we learn from this? What we can learn from this is that a person can be inspired from their parents and learn the good things. And the greater the parents, the more, of course, there is to learn from them. But they also have their own spiritual way. It's not copy paste. The very fact or the proof that they learned the spiritual road from their parents is that they now have their own spiritual path. So it's not unusual that Isaac would want to do something different than Abraham. He might be a little bit hesitant about it, but he knows that that's what he wants to do. And he is very successful with Ishmael and does bring Ishmael back to the fold. And that is the power of Isaac. But he doesn't realize that it's doomed for failure at this point in time with Esau. Maybe later on, yes, his descendants, but at this point in time, it's doomed to failure. And therefore, God intervenes through his wife, Rivka. And when he gives that blessing to Jacob, he realizes, obviously, this is, I don't know why, but for some reason, this is what's supposed to happen. And that's why he never rebukes Jacob for doing what he did. He doesn't rebuke Rebecca. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't say that was a terrible thing. Nothing. When his wife says, now I want to send him to get married in the house of Laban, so he gives him the blessing, Abraham, no questions asked. Because Yitzchak was a very spiritual person. He could feel the moment. Even though he didn't understand what was happening, he could feel that this is part of the plan, which is unfolding at this moment. So even though this wasn't his plan, he basically gave in to the divine plan, which he could feel was happening at the moment, which was instigated by his wife, Rivka, without her knowing why she was doing it in the end of the day. So this is something we learn, that your spiritual path, even if it's different than your parents, is a proof that your parents were successful in teaching you a spiritual path, because we all have our own. Shalom, shalom.